The journey begins. The morning air at Atlanta International Airport buzzed with the usual intensity of movement. Airplanes lifting off with a growl in the background. Announcements echoing through terminals. People rushing past one another with their lives tucked into rolling suitcases. It was a typical day, and yet for Sundar Pichai, it was anything but ordinary. Dressed in his freshly pressed military uniform, a navy blue beret tucked under his arm, and medals that shimmered ever so slightly with the morning light, he walked through the terminal with a composed expression that masked the whirlwind inside him. He had just completed his most challenging deployment yet. 7 months in a volatile zone where every morning could be your last, and every night might be a curtain call. And now, as he walked through the terminal, he felt a kind of weight lift from his shoulders. But it wasn't just the end of his service tour that made today different. It was also the beginning of something deeply personal, a journey back to his roots. Sundar wasn't born in the United States. He had been raised in the narrow streets of Chennai, India, in a modest 2-room home with crumbling walls, flickering lights, and a single shared fan that battled the scorching summer heat. His father had been a clerk at the General Post Office and his mother, a school teacher with an unshakable belief in the power of education. Their lives had been simple, grounded in routine and resilience. What they lacked in wealth, they made up for in spirit. His father, though soft-spoken, carried the wisdom of generations in his voice, and his mother, who wore her sari with pride and strength, often told him, "Your roots are where your strength lies. Never forget where you came from." He never had. Even after immigrating to the United States as a teenager, adapting to the strange accent, the colder weather, and the occasional glance that lingered a bit too long because of the color of his skin, he had carried his culture in his heart. When he decided to join the U.S. Army, some had questioned his choice. Others had quietly judged. Why fight for a country that might never fully accept you? But Sundar wasn't driven by resentment. He believed in duty, in honor, and in the strange, complicated beauty of a nation made from many stories, including his own. Now on this spring morning, Sundar was on his way to receive a commendation from the Department of Defense. It wasn't just a medal, though there would be one. It was recognition for saving 6 of his fellow soldiers during a surprise ambush in Kandahar. He had carried 2 on his back, ran into open fire, and radioed for air support even as bullets tore through the air around him. The others had survived because of his courage. The Pentagon had called it heroism under impossible circumstances, but Sundar didn't see it that way. To him, it had simply been the right thing to do. With a printed boarding pass in hand, he walked up to the gate. His ticket was for first class, a gift from a fellow soldier who had upgraded him using miles before leaving for another mission. It was a small gesture of gratitude from a comrade whose life he had saved. But Sundar had hesitated even accepting it. He had grown up watching his parents save every rupee, skip every luxury, and choose practicality over comfort. Sitting in first class felt like stepping into a different world. Still, today, he allowed himself that grace, not for the status of it, but for what it symbolized. A moment to breathe, a space to reflect, and the opportunity to look back at the miles he had traveled, not just geographically, but spiritually. As he walked toward the boarding line for first class, he noticed the glances. They weren't overt, but they were there. Subtle shifts in body language, quick flickers of confusion or discomfort. He had grown used to it. A man of color, in uniform, walking into a space that many still subconsciously reserve for a certain look or background. But he kept his chin up, not out of pride, but dignity. When his group was called, he moved forward. And that's when it happened. A tall man in a crisp business suit, graying hair combed neatly to the side, looked him up and down. His lips twisted into a thin smile, the kind that held more judgment than warmth. "Excuse me," the man said, stepping in front of Sundar just before he reached the gate. "I think you're in the wrong line. Coach is over there." Sundar blinked, not because he was surprised, but because he had encountered moments like this before. They still stung, though less with each passing year. He could have simply flashed his boarding pass and walked on. But before he could even respond, the gate agent, a young woman named Alicia, who had noticed the confrontation, spoke up. "Sir," she said to the man, "this passenger is in the right line. He's in first class." There was a pause. The businessman glanced at Sundar's uniform, the badge on his chest, the beret under his arm. He sneered. "Well," he said, loud enough for others to hear, "I suppose anyone can sit in first class these days." The comment wasn't just about class or seating. It carried weight, the unspoken judgment about race, about background, about belonging. The passengers nearby suddenly looked away or pretended not to hear. The gate fell silent for a moment. Sundar felt the heat rise in his chest, but instead of responding with anger, he did something else entirely. He walked past the man, boarded the plane, and took his seat in 2A, calmly, quietly, with the same poise he had used when facing down armed insurgents, because sometimes silence was more powerful than 1,000 words. But he didn't forget. Once he had settled in, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small notebook. It was weathered, worn from years of travel, filled with sketches, letters, and memories. From one of the back pages, he tore out a clean sheet. With a pen he kept tucked beside his dog tags, he began to write. It wasn't a note of anger or resentment. It wasn't even a defense. It was something else entirely. He folded it neatly, called over the flight attendant, and handed it to her with a quiet request. "Please give this to the man in 4C, he said. The note would reach him before takeoff, but what it said, and the impact it would leave, was something no one on that flight would ever forget. The note. As the aircraft glided down the runway, humming with the collective tension and anticipation of a long-haul journey, the cabin settled into a soft lull. Overhead compartments clicked shut. Phones were switched off. First-class passengers adjusted their seat belts and reclined slightly, clutching either the Wall Street Journal or a pre-boarding mimosa. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign echoed through the cabin as the plane lifted from the ground, like a bird released from a firm grip. In seat 4C, Charles Whitman, a seasoned hedge fund executive from Manhattan, with 20 years of hardened corporate experience behind him, and just as many prejudices built up over time, was already sipping his whiskey on the rocks. His eyes drifted lazily around the cabin, his mind calculating business moves, scanning the seats for familiar faces, and occasionally glancing at the soldier who now sat quietly in 2A, staring out the window with the distant look of a man who had seen more than his share of war. Charles didn't want to admit it, but the uniform bothered him. Not because he didn't respect the military. In fact, his father had served during Vietnam. It was just complicated. Something about seeing a brown-skinned man in first class, in that uniform, felt like a contradiction he couldn't articulate. It wasn't conscious racism, or at least that's what Charles would have told himself. It was something deeper, buried under decades of unconscious bias, and a lifetime in circles where first class meant success, polish, and, if unspoken, a certain pedigree. When the flight attendant appeared at his side with a small folded note, he looked up, puzzled. "This is for you," she said, gently placing it on his tray table. From the gentleman in 2A. Charles raised an eyebrow, picked it up cautiously, and unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, penned with the kind of careful precision one might expect from a man used to issuing reports or writing letters in a combat zone. It wasn't long, but it was dense with meaning. It read, "Dear Sir, I noticed your discomfort earlier, and while I understand we come from different walks of life, I wanted to share something with you, not in anger, but in the hope that stories can sometimes build bridges where silence builds walls. I was not born in this country. I came here as a teenager with a bag full of books and a heart full of dreams. My parents, who could never afford a plane ticket themselves, taught me that honor and dignity were not reserved for wealth or status. I joined the U.S. Army not for a paycheck or recognition, but because I believed in what this country could be. not always what it is, but what it aspires to become. The seat I sit in was a gift, a gesture of gratitude from a fellow soldier whose life I helped save. But I didn't earn it in war. I earned it by listening when others shouted, by standing when others fell, and by believing in the goodness of people, even when that goodness hides behind walls of assumption and habit. You judged me. That's not a crime. It's human. But I invite you to consider, what if the person next to you, regardless of their accent, their color, or the cut of their uniform, had a story you could learn from? I don't need your apology. I just wanted to offer a glimpse behind the uniform, in case you ever wonder who we are. With respect, Sundar Pichai, Sergeant, United States Army. Charles read the note twice, then a third time, the cabin's gentle hum growing louder in his ears. Something in him shifted, just slightly, like tectonic plates that move beneath the surface, but changed the landscape forever. He looked up at Sundar again, who had resumed staring out the window, lost in thought. The soldier's posture was calm, but not passive. There was strength in it, the quiet, disciplined kind that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. For the next few hours of the flight, Charles found himself unable to return to his magazine or his usual posturing. The whiskey lost its edge. The numbers running in his head dissolved into fragmented memories of his father's military stories, of fear and valor, of nights spent under foreign skies, and the men who had stood beside him in the mud, regardless of race or religion. He remembered his father speaking once about a young black soldier who had carried him on his back after a minefield explosion, and how that act had saved his life. He remembered, too, how his father had wept telling that story, one of the rare times Charles had seen him cry. He had forgotten that story, or perhaps he had pushed it aside as he climbed the corporate ladder, wrapped himself in the illusion of meritocracy, and slowly let the comfort of privilege numb the clarity of empathy. Meanwhile, Sundar sat silently in 2A, unaware of the full weight his words had just stirred. He wasn't looking for redemption or recognition. He had written that note for one reason only, because he believed in dialogue. Because even after witnessing the worst of humanity in combat zones, civilian casualties, betrayals, lives lost for politics, he still believed that words, if chosen carefully, could change people more than bullets ever could. As the flight reached cruising altitude, the memories of his last mission surged forward in his mind, uninvited but persistent. The night of the ambush replayed behind his eyes like an old film reel. It had been just after midnight when they were hit. The air was dry, the moon low. The convoy had been moving through a ravine when the first explosion ripped through the silence. 2 Humvees had gone up in flames instantly. Chaos followed. Gunfire, smoke, screaming. Sundar had pulled Private Levinson from under a collapsed steel door, his own shoulder dislocated in the process. He had then sprinted back under fire to pull out Sergeant Keeley, whose leg had been nearly severed. Later, when the medevac arrived and they counted the living and the lost, his commanding officer had placed a hand on his good shoulder and simply said, "You kept the heart beating, Sergeant." Sundar had not cried then, nor when the commendation letter arrived. But he had wept silently, alone, in his tent, when he realized Keeley would walk again, because they had believed each other worthy, regardless of difference. It was those memories, layered with pain and pride, that kept him humble, and also gave him a strange kind of strength, the kind that Charles was only beginning to recognize. Somewhere above the Atlantic, hours into the flight, Charles finally stood. He took slow, deliberate steps toward the front of the cabin, stopping beside Sundar's seat. The cabin was dim now, lights turned down. Passengers dozing were lost in in-flight movies. Sundar looked up, meeting his gaze. Charles didn't offer a rehearsed apology. He didn't extend a hand stiff with performance. Instead, he said, quietly and sincerely, "Thank you for what you wrote, for what you've done, for reminding me that we can always be better." Sundar nodded, not with smugness, but with grace. "I appreciate that," he replied, voice calm, almost fatherly in its cadence. And with that, The tension dissipated, not in an explosion of reconciliation, but like fog lifting slowly from a field, revealing clearer ground beneath. Home is a memory that waits. The plane touched down in Washington, D.C., as the morning sky yawned open, with a wash of pale blue, streaked with gold. As the wheels hit the tarmac with a muffled thud, and the plane taxied toward the gate, Sundar Pichai sat unmoving, a quiet pillar among the rustle of passengers gathering their belongings and pressing against invisible lines of impatience. The city outside was just beginning to stir, unaware of the man inside that plane who carried more than luggage. He carried weight, memory, and the silent burden of those who had not returned. He waited until most of the passengers had exited, not because he wanted to avoid them, but because he had learned something valuable in war. Sometimes, stillness was the most powerful act. It was in those moments, when the dust settled, that you truly saw what was left behind. As Sundar stepped off the plane, his boots hitting the ground like punctuation marks on a sentence yet unfinished, he took a deep breath. The air here was cooler, cleaner somehow. It didn't smell of sand or gunpowder. It smelled like hope laced with history. It smelled like the beginning of something else. Outside the terminal, a black government vehicle waited for him, clean, clinical, with tinted windows that offered no reflection. The driver, a young woman in civilian dress but clearly military trained, greeted him with a brisk nod and opened the door. "Welcome to D.C., Sergeant Pichai," she said. "We've been expecting you." He returned the nod and slid into the back seat, his mind already spinning, not with nerves, but with the sharp, clear focus that always preceded moments of great importance. The ceremony wasn't until the next day, but his itinerary was full: medical debriefings, a sit-down with defense officials, and a brief but symbolic visit to Arlington National Cemetery, where a few of his fallen friends now rested under solemn white stones. But there was something else he needed to do before all that. Something not on the schedule. He asked the driver to make a detour. An hour later, Sundar found himself standing in front of an old brick building in northwest D.C., not grand or symbolic, but deeply personal. It was the apartment where he had lived for 6 months during his first year in America. A rundown unit with peeling paint and an ever-leaking faucet, shared with 3 other immigrants, all chasing dreams bigger than their pockets could hold. He hadn't been back in over a decade. The new tenants had changed the curtains. The sidewalk had new cracks, but the essence remained. He stood there for a moment, letting memory wash over him. He remembered eating rice and dal off a paper plate, sitting cross-legged on the floor with textbooks sprawled around him. He remembered calling his mother on a scratchy connection, her voice always cheerful even when she knew he was skipping meals to save on grocery bills. He remembered that apartment not as a struggle, but as a shrine of beginnings. Later that evening, Sundar checked into the modest hotel arranged by the Department of Defense. It was neat, sterile in a way only government accommodations could be. White sheets tucked with military precision, a television he wouldn't turn on, and a stack of briefing folders on the desk. He ignored them for now and sat by the window, the city humming quietly beneath him. And then he opened his notebook again. This time, he didn't write to anyone in particular. He wrote to remember. He wrote about the day his father cried when he received the letter confirming Sundar's acceptance into an American university. He wrote about the time his squad in Afghanistan, made up of a Puerto Rican medic, a white farm boy from Iowa, and a Korean-American radio tech, had sat around a fire and shared stories of their mothers. He wrote about the time he watched an Afghan boy give his only bottle of clean water to a wounded soldier. He wrote because stories, once told, no longer imprisoned you. They became bridges. They became seeds. And somewhere, in a high-rise condominium on the other side of town, Charles Whitman was still holding that note. It hadn't left his pocket since the plane landed. He'd read it again in the back of his car, as the Capitol buildings blurred past him. Something in him had shifted, not like a grand theatrical epiphany, but like the quiet click of a lock turned from the inside. That night, Charles sat at his kitchen table with his wife, Ellen, who had long given up trying to soften his hardened views. But something was different in his posture, in his words. "There was a soldier on my flight," he said simply. "Young guy. Indian. Wrote me a note that I think I needed to read more than I knew." And for the first time in a long while, Ellen saw the Charles she had once fallen in love with, a man capable of empathy, of change. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Maybe you should tell that story," she said. "More people need to hear it." Back at the hotel, Sundar closed his notebook and checked the time. Tomorrow would be full of cameras and handshakes, speeches and photos, but tonight was about grounding. He reached into his duffel and pulled out a small wooden box, carved with intricate designs of Tamil origin. Inside was a simple photograph, him at age 12, standing beside his mother in a schoolyard, both of them smiling as though nothing in the world could break them. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "Tomorrow is for them." The next morning arrived with the chill of spring wind brushing against ceremony. The Department of Defense building was already abuzz. Sundar walked in with his uniform pressed, shoes shined, medals displayed. But his heart, as always, carried the real weight of service. And yet, as he stood before the gathered officials, generals, senators, and journalists, he didn't speak about war. He spoke about identity. About growing up in Chennai, learning English from comic books, and watching his father save coins in a rusted box labeled Future. He spoke about coming to America with no guarantees, and about choosing to serve, not because he was asked, but because he believed. He ended his short speech with a line that would later go viral across social media. "I didn't fight for a perfect country. I fought for a country that could become better, and that includes me, and you, and every stranger we meet." The applause was polite at first. Then it grew, uncontrolled, thunderous. Not just because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Without bitterness, without blame, just truth. And standing quietly in the back of that room, away from the cameras and spotlights, was Charles. He had come, uninvited, because he needed to witness the fullness of the man whose presence had haunted and inspired him since the moment he stepped on that plane. When the ceremony ended, Charles waited near the exit. As Sundar walked by, they made eye contact. Charles extended his hand, not stiff, not performative, honest. "I'm here because of that note," he said. "It changed me." Sundar smiled, his handshake firm but kind. "It wasn't the note," he said. "It was always there. Sometimes it just takes a nudge to remember who we are." Ripples in still water. 3 days had passed since the ceremony in Washington, and the echo of Sundar Pichai's words still lingered in the halls of the Department of Defense. The speech, originally meant only for a select audience of officials and servicemen, had taken on a life of its own. Someone, perhaps an aide or a member of the press with a quiet sense of purpose, had recorded the moment on their phone. It was only a few minutes long, grainy, unpolished, but it spread like wildfire through the quiet alleys of the internet, where authenticity still found its sanctuary. Within 48 hours, the clip had been viewed by over 1 million people. But the numbers didn't matter to Sundar. What mattered was what came next. The letters, the emails, the voice messages forwarded through battalion commanders, and even the handwritten notes delivered by strangers. Messages from veterans who had never spoken of their trauma until they heard his words. Notes from high school students who had been bullied for their background and suddenly found validation in his voice. And perhaps most unexpectedly, letters from business executives, retired politicians, and suburban parents who admitted, some reluctantly, others humbly, that they had never stopped to question the lenses through which they viewed the people around them. Back in his modest home in Virginia, Sundar sat on the worn couch in his living room, a cup of spiced tea resting on the table beside him, and read every message. He read them not as praise, but as confessionals. Every line was someone else's attempt to come to terms with the way they had lived, judged, ignored, or misunderstood. Some messages were angry, not at him, but at themselves, at the systems they had benefited from or enforced without reflection. Others were filled with raw gratitude. One, from a young woman named Rachel Enoma, struck him deeply. "Sergeant Pichai, I watched your speech 3 times before I stopped crying. My father is a retired Marine. He's been bitter and broken for years, and we've hardly spoken in the last decade. After watching your video, I shared it with him. We didn't talk about it for a few days. Then last night, he showed up at my door. He said, 'That man reminded me of the soldier who carried me out of Fallujah.' We had dinner together for the first time in 8 years. Thank you, Rachel." It was in that moment that Sundar understood something profound. The note he had written on the plane, meant for one man, born from a moment of quiet resistance, was no longer just his. It had become part of something far larger than his intentions. It had become a spark. But even sparks have origins. And Sundar found himself thinking not just of that moment on the plane, or even of his days in combat. He began to look further back, deeper inward, to the first time he had ever written something intended to change a heart. He thought of his mother. She had been his first teacher, his fiercest advocate, and the quiet fire behind his every decision. He remembered sitting at the small wooden desk in their Chennai apartment as a child, listening to her dictate letters she would send to her students' parents, letters written with compassion, not criticism. She never blamed, even when students failed or misbehaved. Instead, she invited collaboration. She believed that words, when wielded gently, could coax a person toward their better self. He had forgotten how powerful that idea had been, until now. He made a decision that night, not out of pride or ambition, but out of a calling he had tried to ignore. He reached out to his old commanding officer, now retired, and asked for a favor. "Do you still have the contacts of the academy?" Sundar asked. "I do," came the reply. "Thinking of teaching?" Sundar paused. "I think I'm thinking of sharing." Within weeks, Sundar began receiving invitations, first from military academies, then universities, then even corporate diversity forums. They didn't want just another motivational speaker. They wanted him, a man who had lived the complexity of being an outsider in a uniform that demanded unity, a man who had not just seen war, but had seen through it. His first lecture was at West Point. The auditorium was filled with cadets, some wide-eyed, others skeptical, all attentive. He didn't lecture. He told stories. He told them about the day he didn't shoot, even when protocol said he could, because a child stood behind the target. He told them about the time he shared his last water ration with a wounded enemy soldier, knowing the medics were 20 minutes out. He told them about carrying a comrade who had once told him he didn't belong in this army, because when lives were on the line, belonging became irrelevant. And he ended that first session with the same words he had used in D.C. "I didn't fight for a perfect country. I fought for a country that could become better. And that includes me, and you, and every stranger we meet." There was a long silence after he finished. Then, slowly, applause. Not the kind born from obligation, but the kind born from awakening. And in the back row, unnoticed but deeply moved, sat a young cadet named James Whitman, the son of Charles. James had enlisted against his father's initial wishes, determined to forge his own path. But that night, after the lecture, he called his father and said something neither of them expected. "Dad, I saw him. The soldier you told me about. I saw him speak tonight, and I think I understand now why you changed." Charles, listening from his apartment in New York, felt something close to tears, not for the first time, but perhaps for the first time without shame. Sundar didn't know that part yet. He wouldn't for some time. He was too busy moving, traveling, teaching, listening. He never stopped listening. And wherever he went, he encouraged others not just to see the world differently, but to write their own notes, to have their own quiet confrontations with misunderstanding and prejudice. Soon, a movement began, not formal, not organized, but real. People started sharing their seat to stories, moments when they were judged, or when they misjudged, and how they chose to respond with dignity instead of vengeance. Stories began to flood social media with the hashtag note from 2A. A nurse in Alabama, who had been dismissed by a patient because of her hijab, wrote about holding his hand during his last breath, despite his cruelty. A psych cab driver in Toronto shared how he offered a free ride to a man who had once yelled slurs at him during a protest. A high school teacher in rural Kansas wrote about how she invited a student she once punished unfairly to co-lead a classroom discussion on empathy. They were not grand gestures, but they were real. They were ripples in still water. And at the center of those ripples was a man who had once written a note not to change a mind, but to honor his own truth. The roots remember. The plane descended slowly over Chennai, piercing the dense curtain of coastal clouds that had gathered in the early morning sky. The city emerged below like a living tapestry, streets winding like old rivers, buildings rising unevenly like jagged teeth, and colors that pulsed with the spirit of a land both ancient and ever-renewing. From the sky, Sundar Pichai could see it all. The red-tiled rooftops of his childhood neighborhood, the temple spires that once marked his youthful playgrounds, and the crowded roads already buzzing with honking scooters and woven auto rickshaws. The scent of Chennai wasn't something you could detect from the air, but he could already feel it stirring in his memory. Spiced masala, warm jasmine garlands, and the damp heaviness of sea breeze mixed with dust and devotion. It had been nearly 14 years since he last stood on this soil. 14 years of distance, not just in miles, but in the silent spaces that form between a boy and the life he leaves behind. When he had left, he had been just a student, a quiet dreamer with worn shoes, tucked-in shirts, and a head full of equations and ambition. Now, as the plane wheels scraped the tarmac and rolled to a halt, he was a decorated American soldier, a public speaker, a symbol in many ways. But here, in this land, none of those titles mattered. Here, he was just Sundar, a son, a neighbor, a memory etched into 1,000 small moments scattered across crumbling walls and sun-drenched verandas. The airport hadn't changed much. Maybe a few electronic signs had replaced the old boards, and the security systems looked newer, but the smell, the humidity, the chaotic rhythm of voices layered in Tamil, Hindi, English, and Malayalam, it was all still the same. Stepping out into that rhythm felt like stepping into a song he hadn't heard in years, but somehow still knew the words to. Waiting just beyond the glass sliding doors, leaning heavily on a wooden cane but standing tall in spirit, was Mr. Pichai. His father, now in his late 60s, thinner, slower, but unmistakably proud. His mother had passed away 3 years earlier, a quiet loss Sundar hadn't been able to process fully from across the ocean, not even when he folded her photograph into the lining of his uniform vest during deployment. But his father had waited. He had written once a week, even when Sundar didn't reply, each letter a mixture of simple updates and quietly loaded phrases, like, "I hope you eat well, son, and do you remember our evening tea on the roof?" They embraced without words, not out of distance, but out of reverence. Sometimes language collapses under the weight of a moment, and this was one of those times. His father touched his shoulder, his arm, his face, almost as if checking to ensure Sundar was real, not just pixels on a screen or paragraphs in a military newsletter. "You've changed," his father said at last, smiling. "So have you," Sundar replied, tears caught in the corner of his voice. The ride through the city was slow, as all rides in Chennai were. Cows wandered near sidewalks, vendors called out offers in rhythmic bursts, and billboards hung heavy with faces of local politicians and Tamil movie stars. But Sundar wasn't looking out the window for landmarks. He was watching the expressions on the people's faces. The tired vegetable seller, the school children in dusty uniforms, the cycle rickshaw driver wiping sweat from his brow. And for a moment, it struck him. This was what he had fought for, too. Not just the nation that gave him a passport, but the spirit of home that gave him purpose. They arrived at the old apartment complex near T. Nagar, tucked between a dilapidated grocery stand and a small shrine where marigolds and incense offered protection to the neighborhood. The building looked smaller now, but that was always the way of returning as an adult. The ceilings lower, the walls closer together, as though time had shrunk them in the absence of childhood wonder. Inside, the apartment was nearly identical to how he had left it. The fan still wobbled slightly when it turned. The framed photo of his mother still hung above the mantel, her eyes as serene as ever. The bookshelf still held volumes of Tagore, Gandhi, and dusty engineering manuals that his father had once read with him by candlelight during power outages. Sundar walked to the small courtyard in the back, where his mother used to grow tulsi and jasmine. The plants were gone now, replaced by patches of dry earth and scattered leaves. But the soil still smelled the same, like memory. He knelt down, ran his fingers through the dirt, and closed his eyes. "She wanted you to plant something new," his father said softly behind him. "She used to say, when Sundar comes home, he will bring something beautiful." Sundar felt something deep in his chest unwind. A thread of guilt he hadn't known was still knotted. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small tin wrapped in cloth. Inside were tulsi seeds he had brought from Virginia. He didn't say anything. He just began to plant. The next few days were a quiet symphony of reconnection. Old neighbors came by, some with smiles, others with questions. Children ran up to him, more curious about his uniform than his story. He visited his old school, where the principal, now a soft-spoken man with gray in his beard, welcomed him back like a legend returned to his village. Sundar gave a short talk to the students, not about war, not about politics, but about choice. "I chose to serve," he told them, "not because I was brave, but because I was afraid of forgetting what mattered." Sometimes, service is not about fighting. It's about remembering. On the fifth night, after a modest dinner of sambar rice and fried okra made by his father's caretaker, Sundar climbed to the roof. The stars above Chennai were fewer now, drowned by city lights and smoke, but the breeze was still generous, still heavy with the scent of distant flowers and the sea. He opened his notebook again. This time, he wrote not for others, but for himself. "I thought I needed to prove something to my adopted country, to the men who doubted me, to the uniform that sometimes weighed more than it should. But coming back here has reminded me, I don't need to prove I belong. I do belong. To this land, to that land, to any place where I show up with open hands and honest eyes. My mother once said, a good man can grow roots anywhere, if his heart is not afraid of the soil. I think I am ready to grow again." He closed the book, placed it beside him, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, he just sat, not preparing a speech, not remembering a battle, not replaying a moment of confrontation, just being. Downstairs, his father was asleep in his armchair, the radio softly playing an old Tamil devotional song. The city buzzed and breathed around them. Life continued. And somewhere, in the old courtyard, the tulsi had begun to sprout, small, stubborn, and sacred. The note that echoed forever. Weeks had passed since Sundar's return to Chennai, and the heat of the Indian summer had begun to settle over the city like a great slow exhale. The air grew heavier, the sky a hazy sheet of white, and the hum of ceiling fans became the household anthem once more. But despite the thickening heat, a certain calm had taken root within Sundar, a peace not born of comfort or rest, but of clarity. In the time he'd spent walking through the worn streets of his boyhood, sitting at the feet of his aging father, and watering the tulsi plant that now stood proudly in the courtyard, something had shifted. He no longer felt caught between worlds. He had stopped measuring his worth against other men's expectations. He had begun, instead, to simply be. One morning, as he helped his father sort through an old trunk of letters and belongings, Sundar found something he hadn't expected. At the very bottom of the chest, Underneath old receipts, a few yellowing certificates, and faded school report cards was an envelope addressed to him in his mother's delicate handwriting. His heart stuttered as he lifted it gently, his fingers trembling slightly as though touching something sacred. He sat on the floor beside the trunk and slowly opened the letter. The paper inside was brittle, the ink slightly smudged from the years, but her voice was unmistakable, elegant, composed, and full of that gentle authority that had guided him for so long, even in her absence. My dearest Sundar, if you are reading this, it means you have found your way back home, not just in geography, but in spirit. I wrote this for a day I always believed would come, when your path would bring you back to where you began. I have watched you grow into a man of silence, strength, of depth and direction. Even when you were a boy, you carried a question in your eyes. What do I owe the world? You always asked it in everything you did. My son, you owe the world only one thing: your truth. The truth of your compassion, the truth of your courage, and above all, the truth of your softness. You were never weak. You were tender, and the world will try to mistake the two, but never let them confuse you. You will wear uniforms, earn medals, meet important people, but do not forget, the people who need you most may never applaud you. They will see you in silence. Help them anyway. And always, always come back to the soil that first gave you life. With all my love, Amma. By the time he finished reading, tears had traced silent paths down his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. He allowed them to stay. They were proof not of grief, but of grounding. His mother's words were not instruction. They were affirmation. She had always known the journey he would take, even before he did, and she had trusted him to find his way. That afternoon, Sundar wrote a letter of his own, not to anyone specific, but to the idea that had once compelled him to write that note on the airplane. The note that had started this entire cascade of understanding and reflection. He wrote not for recognition, but for preservation. He wanted to remember what it felt like to give voice to dignity. There are moments in life when silence is easier, when walking away feels like the safe path. But every now and then, you are called to speak, not to shout, not to argue, but to offer something deeper than words, a mirror. That day on the plane, I didn't want to correct a man. I wanted him to look at himself and remember that he too had the capacity for empathy. That single note taught me more than any battle ever could, because it showed me that sometimes we are not here to change the whole world. We are here to nudge one heart and trust that it will ripple outward. And it did. Oh, how it did. He folded the letter, tucked it into his journal, and then made one final decision before returning to the U.S. He would publish a book, not about war, not about strategy, but about the quiet power of dignity. He would collect stories, not just his own, but those of others who had found grace in confrontation and humanity in conflict. The project would be titled The Note in Seat 2A, a simple title, but one with echoes. The book, once released a year later, would go on to reach millions, but more important than sales or headlines was the impact it had on everyday lives. Teachers began assigning the opening chapter in high school civics classes. Corporations used it as part of inclusion training, not for checkbox diversity, but to encourage real, lived empathy. Veterans who had never spoken of their stories began to write their own letters. Young people started carrying small notebooks, writing thoughts not for posts or platforms, but for perspective. In a quiet suburb of New York, Charles Whitman, now retired, kept a copy on his nightstand. On the inside cover, he had scribbled a personal reminder in pencil. Remember, you were once wrong, and that means you can be right again. His son, James, now serving as a field medic, carried the same book in his pack, the pages dog-eared and underlined, marked with memories of the man who had once changed the course of his father's path with a single paragraph. And as for Sundar Pichai, he continued to serve, not with a rifle, not with rank, but with remembrance. He taught at academies, wrote when inspired, and most of all, listened. He became known not as the soldier who wrote the note, but as the man who reminded the world what respect looked like when practiced, not preached. Years later, long after the Tulsi plant had grown into a bush and his father had passed peacefully in his sleep, Sundar returned once more to Chennai. This time, not for duty, but for legacy. He visited the school, the apartment, the shrine, and on a warm evening, under the same stars he had once stared at in silence, he planted a second bush beside the first. This one, in memory of all the people who had written back, who had read his note and responded with their own. He didn't know most of their names. He never would. But the echo remained. And in a world that often shouts, the note from seat 2A whispered still, across nations, across wounds, across hearts, reminding us that grace is not weakness, and that the most powerful revolutions often begin in quiet places, written in ink, carried in the heart.